Okay, well, I think we should get started. Hopefully people will continue to join us. I'm Virginia Cox, co-editor-in-chief of Real Progressives. I'm also a member of the Program Management Office. And I want to welcome you all to our fourth national outreach call, which is actually an international outreach call, as evidenced by our special guest, Bill Mitchell, who's here all the way from Australia. Real Progressive is founded on four pillars of policy, education, activism, and media. Sets us apart from other progressive organizations is our commitment to promoting modern monetary theory, MMT. Because without understanding how our economy works and how currency is created, even the best intentioned people get tripped up on how to pay for all the programs we need so desperately. But understanding that we can afford these things and how we can afford these things is only part of the challenge, because we have to be able to convince others that it's possible. And we haven't been doing a great job of that, but that's where tonight's guest comes in. In a moment, Real Progressives founder Steve Grumbine will introduce Bill Mitchell properly, but if you'll bear with me for a minute, I just want to tell you why I'm so excited about tonight's talk. Back in the 90s, Frank Luntz began advising this radical new Republican caucus in Congress, led by Newt Gingrich. Most of you know who he is. Now, Frank Luntz was a pollster, but his strength was exploiting the emotional content of language. And since then, I've read George Lakoff, and I know what framing is, but back then I only knew it as talking points. So I don't know if you remember, but when estate taxes became death taxes, that was Frank Luntz. He made any discussion of healthcare reform, the Republicans would call it government takeover of healthcare. These are all tricks of language framing. I think the brilliant one was the expression pro-life, because it implies that if you support a woman's right to choose, then you must be anti-life or pro-death. I think that's brilliant framing and horrible. Anyway, neocons quickly grasp the power of language, but the left has yet to catch on. So we were really pleased to learn that Bill Mitchell has put quite a bit of thought into the topic of tonight's talk, which is framing MMT. Bill and his wife, Louisa Connors, wrote a paper on the subject and found on his website, bilbo.economicoutlook.net. And Bilbo is spelled B-I-L-B-O. Bilbo.economicoutlook.net.
Thank you all very much for joining us. I've known Bill Mitchell for a number of years now, and he and his wife have been incredibly gracious, incredibly supportive, incredibly giving of their time, incredibly long-suffering, as we have tried to do that mind meld to learn this stuff so that we can be good stewards of the message. And I just have to tell you, I have been so overwhelmed with love, and I don't mean to sound dorky, but I mean honest to goodness, so overwhelmed with love from both Bill and Louisa over this time. They've supported me personally, they've supported our mission, and proudly wore buttons in territories where our button maybe wasn't as well received. They have been just absolutely some of our biggest supporters. And without their help and without, Bill's wonderful grace and calm patience, so much of what I've learned would have never happened. We have a podcast called Macro and Cheese, and it's become something I love dearly as well. It is a very, very high quality podcast with great information. And Bill was our very first show, putting the T in MMT. And he really helped us understand the theoretical framework so that it wasn't just sort of like a nebulous idea that he understood. He allowed us to understand how a series of congruent ideas came to make up the body of knowledge that is MMT, the framework and the logical groupings of all the deep scholarship that has gone into this. And I've been very blessed to have an opportunity to be around him and watch him and learn from him, and by extension share him to you all. So it's with that I want to say welcome to you, Mr. Bill Mitchell, professor, dear friend. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for inviting me.
You got it.
What I was asked to speak about was slow down. Was the concept of framing and language. We cover it in our book in chapter 8 in our textbook. It's the only macroeconomics textbook that you'll find that considers the way in which you actually express economics matters. And so that's an important addition. Next slide please, when we're listening to the radio or watching the TV or reading whatever we read in the sort of popular media, macroeconomic concepts are out there all the time. They're in our face every day, and you can't open a newspaper or listen to a report on the news without a macroeconomic concept coming about. Now, the problem is that macroeconomics as an academic discipline is difficult anyway because it deals with these abstract aggregates. So, for example, there's no such thing as a price level, but we talk about a price level all the time. There's millions of prices, and macroeconomics aggregates it into one concept. So that's difficult for people to understand. Not for me, because I've been at it for years, but I understand it's difficult for people to understand. And social media has, the rise of social media certainly helped the development of modern monetary theory, but it also exacerbates the aim of getting people to understand what we're talking about. Because there's every day I see a new social media expert on MMT, and they're really just operating at a trivial level that leads to distortion and misunderstanding. Now, I don't want to criticise people's good intentions, but I gave a talk in Adelaide last week, or the week before, and I made the point that this is an academic discipline. Macroeconomics is not something you can summarise in one or two tweets and think that that's a satisfactory explanation. So that's the first point. The other thing is that the already difficult to understand concepts are then manipulated through language and framing to form ideological agendas. And what we obviously see everywhere is how our ideas are abused, not only by those who wish to tear them down, but also by those who think that they're doing the right thing by advancing our ideas. An issue. And the reasons why our ideas have been resisted is because they're counterintuitive. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the intuition, anything natural that we are born with, intuition bred into us in a sense by ideology, by framing, by language, and what we now call the neoliberal agenda has been incredibly successful in the way in which it operates to disabuse us of understanding things that are not consistent with the way in which the agenda is wanting us to go. And so MMT has two challenges. One is the educational challenge, and the other is to get our framing language right and to learn how to use the communication modes like social media in an effective way rather than a destructive or ineffective way. Next slide, please. And this is where we have to start, because I see often on the internet, on Twitter, I don't use Facebook, but I see it on Twitter a lot, that, oh, when we have things will be better. Or from the other side, if we ever have MMT, it'll be a disaster. And that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of what our work is about. It's not a regime that we go to. It's not a system of policy that we would go to. It's what we call a lens. And I've got my glasses on today so I can see better. MMT really allows us to see better as to how the system operates. The capacities of the currency issuing government are within that system. Now, if you think about what that, and if we have clearer vision, then all of the framing that's thrown up against that vision is very easily exposed. We can very easily see that the framing isn't a verity, it's a myth. And it allows us then, and I've written here, expose the veil of ideology. Now, what that means is that, your own previous president at one stage during the crisis said, we've run out of money. And politicians use this sort of storyline all the time. And now, if all of us have an MMT understanding, which is what I call this lens, then we just wouldn't accept one of our elected representatives saying, we've run out of money if it's a currency issuing government. That politicians would soon learn that they can't operate in that way. And so, to me, it enhances the quality of our democracy. Now, so if it's just a lens, then how do we get anywhere other than just to say, feel content that we know how things work? Well, we want to have policies because we want to advance well-being, we want to improve people's lives, we want to improve our capacity to interact with the natural environment in a sustainable way, and all the rest of the things that progressive desires to be achieved. And to advance policy within that understanding, we have to then overlay our value systems, our judgments as to what we believe in. And that's where policy comes from. So there's very little in MMT, the core body of work. Some people get a bit confused and think, oh, well, we advocate a job guarantee. Well, that's slightly different, and I'll come back to that if you want. It's slightly different to a sort of suite of policies. That's much more of a core concept relating to efficiency than it is a policy goal. But I'll close. So they're the two challenges. Hit enter. Can you just hit the, yeah, that's it. So the first challenge is education, and I spend heaps of time talking about that and writing about it. That education polishes our lens, makes us understand things better. These are complex things. They can't be distilled in simple ways. And so and not only do we have to learn the stuff that MMT has developed, but in a way to appreciate it in context, we really have to have a better feeling for the way the mainstream operates. So that's one challenge. And the other challenge is the challenge of cognition. And this is overcoming the dissonance that we all have when we're confronted with these ideas on the basis of our years and years of conditioning that has been generated by the framing, the neoliberals, the mainstream. Next slide, please. So when we talk about cognition, what we're really talking about here, the field of cognitive linguistics is about how do we establish meaning, how do we, and how do we use language to with cognition to establish meaning. And there's a whole stack of basic principles really go into. The basic principles of the way we do cognate and learn things is we have what's called an embodied mind. And what that means is we relate our understandings of complex world around us in an embodied way, a physical way. So we talk about being blind with rage, and we have metaphors like more is up. So we always think if something's going up, it must be more. If something's going down, it must be less. And the other basic principle, and I'm really skating here quickly, is that our thought is mostly unconscious. We don't think logically very often. And so often we are shocked to discover that we have internally inconsistent positions. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of metaphors, there's a quote from George Lakoff there. What we use metaphors and metaphorical frames whenever we think and speak. And this relates to the way in which we cognate in terms of a physical way, an embodiment. And so an example there, it's quite counterintuitive to think that a deficit is desirable, because a deficit is something, a shortfall, it's something that's less, it's something that's down. And metaphorically, we've been trained to think that something that's more, that's good, that's up and happy is not something that's a shortfall or a deficiency. And the term deficit has been hammered into us to have that connotation. Next slide, please. Now, the other thing, and this is the work that Louisa has done in her PhD studies in the past, the concept of construal. And construal is, the way we construe things. And the important findings in the literature is that we can attach meaning to the same information in different ways, depending on the way in which the framing in the language is presented to us in that context. And what that means is that we can believe one thing and as being meaning in one context and hold that view incredibly powerfully. But if we're approached with a different framing and language about the same thing, we can alter our meaning 180 degrees. And that's an incredibly important thing. So this idea that you're just wedded to your belief systems is largely to do with the way in which you've been, the embodiment process has been framed to you, and the language that's been used to allow you to reach that belief system and your concept of meaning. And so if you're confronted with a different framing in language, then you can change your views on all sorts of things that you held dear to your heart. And so that literature then challenges is how do progressives exploit this human capacity of construal when we want to change the whole economic narrative away from the mainstream neoliberal narrative into a more progressive narrative. Next slide, please. Now, here's one frame, and with language about it, and this is what we call the neoliberal vision. It has the economy up there, sitting up there on its own as a status separate to us and the planet, and that the two of us, people and planet, serve the economy. We're trained to believe that the economy can get sick if we overstep the mark, if we demand too much from it, like too high a wages growth, or we want the government to spend too much money on progressive things and all those things. And we're trained continually to, in the sort of quasi-religious values of rectitude and faith and work hard and sacrifice, and if you've done well, it must mean that you've sacrificed for the good of the economy. And if you've done poorly, it must mean you've really been a miscreant, you've been lazy. And it's that sort of narrative that, and all the frames that go with it, that has reinforced the neoliberal sort of the individualistic world, that the economy is some sort of natural thing that's separate from us, and we are its servants, and we have to do the right thing to make sure it continues to be well. Next slide, please. And here's an alternative vision, and you can see the differences, that now we're embedded in the planet and the economy is serving us. And in this type of vision, the economy is us. We create it. We create the laws that govern all of the market exchanges. We can regulate it in any way we choose. We can construct laws and rules that are designed to benefit us and not just a small segment of us. And we understand that the government, as the currency issuer, is our agent. It's not something separate from us. And it's certainly not some sort of religious moral arbiter that's there to tell us that we've got to be good sacrificial lambs for the sake of the economy. And so once we have this framing, then we're going to ask questions about, well, what do we want this economy to do? Whereas in the past, in the previous vision, where we've been manipulated to think that the economy is the wealth generator, and if we do the right thing by it, it will keep us in the game. Whereas under this progressive vision, we've got to ask, well, what's the purpose we want to achieve? And this is a much more collective vision, and rather than the individualistic vision of the previous slide. And this collective vision then forces us to confront inequality as to who's missing out, who's benefiting, and that's a totally different narrative. So next slide, please. So those two visions are frames, that's what we mean. And we can accept either one depending upon the supporting framing and language that's used, because a frame structures our thinking in terms of concepts, and then uses language to force us to think about those concepts and conceptual structure in a certain way that the frame dictates. Next slide, please. Now, one of the principles of communication, and this comes a quote from George Lakoff there, denying a frame activates the frame. So now we're getting into strategic ways in thinking about that. Next slide, please. So here's an example. Here's Richard Nixon during the Watergate problems. And some of you will remember this because you lived it closer than I did, but it was on national TV in Australia, and Richard Nixon giving this famous speech where he said, "I am not a crook." Now, if you think about that, he's negating the frame crook. And so not is the negation, crook is the frame. Everyone concluded he was a crook, because a principle of framing is never to negate a frame. So next slide, please. So here's a trap. Virginia sort of gave some hints to traps in her introduction. Here's a trap. Progressives say, we don't want any tax cuts for the rich. And the other way of saying it is tax rises for the rich, but no tax cuts for the rich. Well, no is the negation. That immediately activates the frame, tax cuts for the rich. Now, if then we think about all the other language and framing that we've been confronted with it as we grow as into adults, and to be rich is an aspiration in our Western world. It's a success, and so if we're really attacking the rich, we're attacking success. And the left thinks that, oh well, the taxes permit spending on good things, but the right use the framing tax relief. And because taxes are bad, relief is good. That's the way we've been the metaphors and the embodiment structure of our learning and understanding, that's the way we've been conditioned to think. And so when the left talks about, oh, we've got to increase taxes or not cut taxes so that we can buy things that are progressive, well, they're invoking the frame tax, bad, whereas the right use the tax relief frame, good. So taxes take money away from hard work, give it to those who don't work. And so both frames, the left frame, no tax cuts for the rich, and the right frame, tax relief frame, they both can reinforce the conservative frame. And so the left are really out there thinking they're being, with their heart on their sleeve, thinking they're being good progressives. Really all they're doing is reinforcing the message that they don't, of the conservatives, the right. Next slide, please. Do not use their language. This is from Lakoff. Their language picks out a frame and it won't be the frame you want. So next slide. So do not use their language. What does that mean? Well, that means that whenever you're in a situation, you want to tell a news story. So here's an example, and I get asked, I do radio and TV interviews quite often. And so here's an example that I might have been confronted with. Interviewer, are you in favour of tax relief? And so I don't want to invoke the frame tax relief because I don't want the rich the high income earners to have lower taxes for reasons I explained on my blog yesterday and in the past. So when the interviewer asks me that, I avoid that frame altogether and I answer, I'm in favour of having the government provide first-class public education and healthcare. And you can see what's happened here. I'm not using their language, tax relief. I'm not talking to their frame. I'm changing the language and changing the frame. And that's crucial. Next slide, please. This is the truth sandwich. Start with the truth. If you lead with the lie, you privilege it. Note attempt second, the middle of the sandwich. Note attempt to divert truth. Note, rather than amplify the lie. So you're diverting the truth rather than amplifying a lie. Third step in the narrative. Return to the truth the lie is designed to hide. Don't allow the distraction or diversion to work. So really, if you're wanting to have a discussion with somebody and you're wanting to advance progressive economic thinking, you really don't want to start off by saying, for example, new Keynesian economics lie about the interest rate or lie about the deficit, because you're immediately framing the narrative with the lie. Whereas if you start with the truth and say, government deficits add net financial assets to the non-government sector. Now, you probably wouldn't want to say that at your dinner party, but it's starting with the truth. And then you might say, oh yeah, but the mainstream get that all wrong, and try to divert us from that truth. And then you can reinforce the truth by explaining how fiscal deficits add to our net financial assets. It's really an important strategy not to start with theirs. And if you look at if you've read our macroeconomics textbook, it was a consistent strategy we deployed. Most heterodox economists who've attempted to write macro textbooks typically set up the orthodox mainstream economic theory, and then at the end of each chapter they'll have a section quibbling with it, criticising it. But you've already lost the battle because you've already started with the lie. And so you'll note that in our textbook, where we handle mainstream theory typically is towards the end of the book in history of thought type context. It's not exclusively so, but it's mostly core MMT all the way through because we're starting with the truth. Next slide. Now, what we know is that mainstream macroeconomics really trades on a series of linked myths, and it's reinforced with a heap of really powerful metaphors and language which frame the fake knowledge as truth. And those frames are designed to advance ideological attack on government intervention, but not for us to know that that's what's happening. So next slide. Here are some examples. Now, this is in the textbook, this table. You can also find it on my blog somewhere. But hit the spacebar. Yeah, so here's an example. Here's focus of attack, government spending. The metaphorical claim, spending like a drunken sailor. Now, some of these are culturally specific. So this is one that's often used in Australia by conservative prime ministers. The government's, especially when they're in opposition, the progressive government is spending like a drunken sailor. So next, hit the enter. And what that means is that that metaphor, drunken sailor, is an irresponsible delinquent coming into going wild with women and drink and out of control. Next slide, please. Another one. Budget black hole. That's often, and I see that in almost every commentary in every language. And so hit the enter, please. So you just keep going. So you see that, we've got a black hole that's some sort of astral metaphor, and it's telling you that fiscal policy's gone beyond human control, like a collapse of a massive star. And so the metaphor, the myth is that there's a budget black hole, that a fiscal deficit is somehow dangerous. But then they tie that in with a metaphorical claim about something that we relate to in a different context as being something pretty scary, a collapse of a massive star, and beyond our control. It's just something that needs, we can't do anything about. Next slide, please. And the next one. No, go back to that last one, sorry. Good, thank you. And so one of the problems of the progressive side of politics, and I'm following the American election. I don't want to say everybody here is in the US, because I know that's not true. But following the US election, and certainly the British election campaign that culminated in the December election, you had progressives with all good intentions who confined themselves to the metaphorical space that the mainstream have set. And when I've asked British politicians and Australian politicians, well, why do you do that? Why do you use their framing and their language? And they say, oh, real politic. That's what everybody understands. So we've got to deal with that. And the problem is that you've lost the debate as soon as you enter. And we have in the US we've got Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are really big offenders there. But even Bernie uses mainstream frames and doesn't get the full progressive benefit out of his campaign. Next slide, please. And the next one. So here are some classic myths that are exploited by these metaphors. Next slide, please. So keep going. So this is one of the famous ones, household budget analogy. So the household is a currency issuer. So what this analogy is invoking is to invite us to use our experience with our own finances to make judgments and conclusions and assessments about the government's finances. And so expressions in that previous table about maxing out our credit card and things like that are used to describe governments. They're maxing out their credit card and they've got to pull their belts in. And all of these expressions that we think about in our own lives. But the problem is that the household's a currency issuer and that our personal budget experience generates no knowledge to allow us to make assessments of what the government finances are. There's no, it's not, intuition doesn't help us at all. Our own experience doesn't help us. The government isn't a big household. Next click. Because the government's a currency issuer. And so the alternative narrative should highlight always the special characteristics of the government's currency monopoly. The statements like the government can, see you later, Tuan. Our New Zealand colleagues just leaving, I see. The alternative narrative should talk about what the government, what those characteristics are and what they mean. And, the government can always buy whatever's for sale in its currency because it issues the currency. And that means it can buy all idle labour, which means that it must, if you've got mass unemployment, that must be a policy choice. So once you're sort of steering away from the household and talking about the specific characteristics of a government, you're onto a much more productive narrative. Next, please. Fiscal surpluses are good, deficits are bad. So, we've been led to believe more is up. And as I'll explain later, that can be applied in a reverse direction, because the more, if you associate more is up with one other metaphor, and I'll come back to that later, you get the deficit's bad meaning. And the mainstream logic, of course, is that the deficit's spending beyond our means. We're spending more than we have, and surpluses have all of this military stuff attached to it, that we're keeping our ammunition for later. And the Australian Treasurer was out there yesterday saying, thank God that we were running fiscal austerity that's forced, the reality is it's forced labour underutilisation up to around 13.4%. But his story is, thank God we've done that, because that means we can help in the bushfire relief now, because we've got the ammunition that we built up. Now, that's the logic, and we've been confronted with that, and so we're automatically conditioned to believe that surpluses are somehow good, because if we've got savings privately, well, then that does give us ability to risk manage our private lives. It does mean when our card breaks down, we can fix it, and all the rest of it. Next, MMT understanding. The context is always crucial. You have to understand why the context is crucial and how to explain that. So next point. And what I mean by context is that a fiscal position doesn't exist in isolation. So the mainstream logic always considers the fiscal position as a standalone entity that can be assessed in its own logic. So if it's a deficit, it's bad. If it's a bigger deficit, it's worse. And if it's a surplus, it must be good, and so on, without any context. And so you have to always introduce the context of the fiscal position. And what I mean by context is that, and this is where the sectoral balances are important, because if you've got a country like Norway, which has very strong North Sea energy revenue coming from gas and oil, its government can, and that revenue is coming into the country, its government can still maintain first-class public services. The private domestic sector can save to its heart's ambition. And in that context, the government is likely to have to be able to run a surplus to stop the economy overheating. to stop there being inflationary pressures. So in that sense, we would say a fiscal surplus is appropriate for that sort of country. Now, for a country like Australia, its external deficit's about 3.5% of GDP since the 1970s. If our private domestic sector, households and firms, want to save overall, well, then we have to have a fiscal deficit. And historically, that's what we've had, of 2 or 3% of GDP. And if we try to go to surplus, that's destructive. So that's the context. And so trying to build narratives to immediately introduce the context is absolutely crucial. And then we can use that context and the framework in which we invoke that context to make conclusions. Well, why are surpluses good if they destroy non-government wealth? Because a surplus clearly takes more out of the economy than it puts in and forces us to fund that gap, with the gap being the surplus, fund that gap by by liquidating some of our previously accumulated wealth. So when the Australian Treasurer during the, ran 10 out of 11 surpluses after 1996, he would get on TV and say, this is wonderful. We're getting the debt monkey off our backs. We're saving interest payments. And most people thought that was good. But what was really happening was the debt monkey was our wealth and the interest payments were our income. So what he was really saying in MMT code was that you're destroying our wealth and wrecking our income flows. And so narratives have to drive home those realities, and the opposite being deficits have the opposite effect. Next, please. Next. And here's the other one, that when we're running fiscal surpluses, we're saving up, the nation's saving up. And saving is considered in a metaphorical sense to be a good thing. We're building up, like in North Americans, what are those things? Squirrels. Squirrels run around at the end of summer with getting their acorns and hiding them away. They're saving up, and we think that's a really good thing for them to do. And we have these expressions, we're saving up for a rainy day. That's a metaphor. And we have this other logic that's being used to justify surplus obsession, and that's the ageing society, that, we're all getting older and we won't be able to afford to look after you all unless we save up. So next, please. Well, this is where intuition really is misleading, because even if they're running a surplus, they're not saving the government. Because if you think about what the act of saving is, it's done by a currency user, us, and we're foregoing current consumption, putting it away somewhere so that we hope to get greater future consumption than we would have been able to get otherwise by earning some interest on our savings. And that's the only way we really can, in an intertemporal sense, swap our consumption in period by period. So for us, savings is necessary because we're revenue constrained, we're financially constrained. Whereas for a government that issues its own currency, there's no sense in which it's financially constrained. And so it can always spend what it wants each period, whether it's sensible to spend what it wants, being a political thing, but it can always do that, irrespective of what it's done yesterday. So when the government runs a surplus, it's not saving, it's not increasing its future ability to spend. All it's doing is destroying non-government wealth and undermining our income flows. Next, please. I'm just aware of time here. Mainstream logic, deficits drive up interest rates, crowd out private spending, keep going. Private spending's more efficient, public spending's wasteful, keep going. bad. So that's a really powerful causality structure that the mainstream are continually hammering to prevent governments from running deficits that might be for progressive causes. Of course, they never use this when the deficits are going for their own purposes. And by the way, in the last 2 weeks, the government's in Australia has been spending $2 billion on bushfire relief already. They'll have to spend much more than that. No one has asked at all how they're going to pay for it. That nobody would dare, the right wing wouldn't dare at the moment say anything about that. But anyway, getting back to this deficit, these are causality structures. Now the causality is all wrong, and so we've got to know where to break into the structure. At what point does the house of cards fall down? So next, please. And it's at that point deficits drive up interest rates. So what MMT teaches you is that the impact of deficits are, once all the transactions flow through the banking system, they show up on any particular day as being an excess of reserves in the banking system. And what that then tells you is that those excess reserves ordinarily don't earn any return, certainly not a competitive return. And so the banks try to get rid of those funds by lending them to other banks, because banks don't lend out reserves to us, don't loan them out to us. They can only really lend them within the payment structure. And the problem is, if there's a system-wide surplus of funds because of the fiscal deficit, the banks can't get rid of them. They can shuffle them around, but they can't get rid of the overall surplus of it or excess in the cash system. And so in the process of trying to get rid of them, each individual bank trying to on-lend them to other banks who might be short, they drive the short-term interest rate down. And so at the very start of this causality structure, you can intervene, and that should be where you focus on your attention. Next slide, please. Next. And so the MMT logic, just keep flowing through to the end of this slide, is that deficits increase income, non-government saving rises, banks, loans create deposits. And so here we've got interventions into the causality structure, keep going, right? And so here we've got 3 important areas of communication that you can build up narratives about. Deficits increase income because spending equals income. That's Macroeconomics 101. And we also know that saving is a function of income. And so whenever our incomes rise, non-government saving rises. So there's no finite pool of savings that governments are competing with the private sector over. That's an essential element of the crowding out story. It's wrong. Second element is that they assume that banks are constrained in their ability to lend by that finite pool of savings that are in their bank vaults as deposits. Now, the reality is that the banks are not loans are not supply determined, they're demand determined. And so whenever a borrower who's creditworthy comes through the door, the banks will jump on them and lend them money. Loans create deposits. So there's no finite pool of savings, and the ability to create loans is not restricted by the bank's deposits, because they'll get the reserves later. And so learning those things is very important, and learning simple ways of explaining them are very important. And the third element, which is an increasing level of complexity in a public discussion, is that, well, borrowing's optional anyway for a fiat currency issuing government. They don't have to. Borrowing was an artifact of the fixed exchange rate convertible currency system of the Bretton Woods era. And that ended more or less in 1971. Different countries floated after that at different times, but that's not the system we've got now. And so government doesn't even have to borrow. So then you've got a narrative that emerges, well, why the hell do they keep borrowing? And so, I've written a lot about, I see borrowing as corporate welfare. And, you can have narratives coming out of that enhance the progressive message. Next, please. Government will run out of fiscal space, so they'll be bankrupt. And, this is relating it again to our personal experience. MMT logic is financial ratios are largely meaningless, and fiscal space is defined in terms of resource availability and so on and so forth. And so here we start with last week I had a sequence of stories, and here we start with we've gone to the money story, where the currency issuer is a monopolist. Now we're into a resource story, that the constraint on a currency issuing government is not financial, it's real resource availability. And if all the real resources are currently being used, well, then there really is no fiscal space at that point in time. And so to create fiscal space, the government doesn't have to save money or anything. It has to create unemployment in the existing real resources. In other words, if it wants to expand its use of real resources, it has to, and they're already being fully used, then it has to deprive the non-government sector of the use. And there's a whole sequence of ways it can do that. And so that's, fiscal space is about resources, not about money. Next. So keep going. Yeah, keep going. I just want to miss a few slides here. Go to the one after the bolts here, next one. So that's the challenge, to develop new frames and language. Next. So here's about, I've got about 8 minutes or 10 minutes to go. Probably 8, I hope. So here's how to start. And this is not my opinion. It comes out of the research literature on communication, on framing, on language, and it's pretty much a well-established approach. And if you think about the way in which the right operate, the conservative framing, this is what they do. So you never start with facts. So on Twitter, for example, and there's this other concept called compassion fatigue. And this is comes out of the psychological literature, that we initially will react to a bad fact, like there's disastrous bushfires killing people in Australia. We'll initially relate to that in an empathetic way and feel concern. But if we're hammered with that every day, then we get what's called compassion fatigue, and we end up becoming inured, and it doesn't have the same impact. But whatever, we should never start an argument or a campaign with facts. So things like, poverty in American cities is 55% or whatever it is, and it's disastrous and stuff like that. What you've got to start with is defining a destination in a campaign we're talking about here. And a destination is about social purpose and aspiration. What do we want our economy to do for us? In beginning an argument, we ask the question, well, what's the economy there for? And the destination is a social purpose to be articulated and narrated, to resonate with and activate frames in our brains that support progressive policy. And once we've conditioned people to think about the destination, and we've activated frames that are progressive, then we can start articulating the operational reality. Next, please. So as an example, there was a group of mayors in New Zealand. They were on both sides of politics, Conservative and Labor, and they were sick of the national government there running austerity in the 1990s and devastating the youth in their cities. So they established the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, and it became a really powerful political agency. And they started off by saying, zero waste of New Zealanders, our youth, our future. They didn't start their campaign by repeating all the problems of glue sniffing and whatever in their local communities. They started off by running a campaign about, we want a zero waste of New Zealanders. And So then the next point to understand is that those goals can't be motherhood statements, because, and they must be associated with concrete actions, because and this is where we invoke what are called event causation structures. So there's a destination, we want to create an event, and we want to create causation. So for example, jobs for all. Now everybody agrees that we want to have jobs for all. Donald Trump's continually talking about jobs for all, and everybody agrees with that. And then once they've got you agreeing with that, they say, throw in a causation structure, free markets will grow the economy and create jobs. Next slide, please. And so what you have to add is to the destination, jobs for all, is an appropriate action in every statement you make. So we want jobs for all, but that means that aggregate government spending has to rise by X% to generate Y million jobs. And so immediately you're creating a causation frame in people's minds that jobs for all requires increased government spending of a certain order of magnitude. And then you say, well, who's responsible for that? How does that happen? And so you've already invoked the responsibility in the causation structure. Event, jobs for all, causation structure, government deficit. And so every statement you've got to make, you've got to think purpose, event, causation, action statements. And what progressive narratives tend to get lost is in the value, the purpose end of the story, in these value statements, and they bleed constantly about all these values and aspirations, but they're pretty light on in terms of the real hardcore event, causation, action statements. And so you've always got to be mindful of that when you're out there tweeting and doing stuff to yeah, it's great to have those grand visions, but you've got to have the causation there. Next slide, please. What's this about? Yeah, so purposes are destinations. We all want to achieve destinations and purposes, and we all judge a success by when we get there. So when we're talking about our destinations, we've got to be thinking about things that will invoke frames and values that will be progressive rather than not. So, for example, in an economics context, we'll always define people as the destination rather than some financial ratio or an economic outcome. So you don't want to be saying, well, we want to rein in the fiscal deficit. You want to say we want to provide jobs for our youth. So you're always thinking the destination is about people, not about things that are not people. And it's pointless then to get locked into debates about financial ratios. And, you know, I wish to help people. I don't like blocking people on Twitter, but I get copied into all these relentless discussions that people just arguing about financial ratios, trying to tell people, no, that's not what a deficit will do. Well, it's just not, it's just invoking the wrong purposes and as destinations. And they just reinforce frames about sacrifice, etc. So always point to desired objects that relate directly to intrinsic frames, the things that we care about. Next, please. So, for example, in terms of the way in which we use language, and this is a real problem. I'm still not very happy with the way I use language. So, you know, government spent X million dollars. Well, the term spent is a really difficult term because that invokes spent. When I go running in the morning, I'm spent at the end of it. I'm tired. I'm gone. I've got to rest. And so spent is a word that we've been trained to believe is not a good thing. Whereas the alternative might be to get the same message. Government invested X million dollars to enhance our purposes, whatever we want to talk about. So investment, more is up metaphor, building up rather than using up. Spent is using up, down, in exhausting. Invest is building up, more, good. And here's where I mentioned before that the more is up can work in reverse. So a deficit is a shortfall, and the more is up. If the deficit rises, why isn't that invoking the good more is up bigger? Well, it's because the deficit, the term we're qualifying, deficit, is considered to be a bad thing, and the term budget also then immediately triggers the household metaphor, and we're immediately back into thinking about government in terms of a big household and trying to apply our own experience to that. So that's why I never use the term in my writing or presentations budget. I always talk about fiscal deficits, because as soon as you use the budget term, that you're gone, in my view. But I haven't been able to overcome using the term deficit yet. I'm still thinking about that. Next slide, please. Just a few more slides. So you can exploit the more is up metaphor using an appropriate event structure, which links so metaphors can be linked. This is this point here. So there's two metaphors here. More is up, purposes are destinations. So in the linguistics literature, these are what we call metaphors. So the destination must always be prominent. So in trying to work out how to talk about a deficit but invoke more is up good, you can say the government deficit rose. Now, if you just said that, then you've cooked. You've invoked all the bad framing. But if then you say, if in the same sentence you say and generated levels of wealth for households and firms, for example. So what are you doing? You're doing the more is up, which if you just had to confine it to the government deficit rose, would have reversed the more is up because of the use of the word deficit, the language. But because you're adding an event structure and a desirable destination, so you're linking the deficits through an event structure to a desirable destination, you can overcome that trap in the language. And so that reinforces the concept of forced movement, which is the way we understand metaphorical statements. Nothing happens unless something happens, unless something happened before it. Something has to force the movement. And in this case, you're saying if we want to have higher wealth for households and firms, the forcing agency is the deficit. And because you've linked that through you've linked those two metaphors through that event structure, you can overcome the problem of using the term deficit rose. Okay, next one, which is the second last one. So causes are forces and causation is forced. So we want to always disabuse our narratives that there's any natural event causation in economics. So mainstream economists talk about natural interest rates, natural rates of unemployment, that the natural position for government is to be in balance, for example. And we want to always disabuse that by invoking these causes of forces and causation is forced metaphors. And so in this case, when we're talking about, say, solving urban poverty, we're wanting to say government action forces movement towards a desired destination. And all of those components have to be in your statements. Without that force, or your arguments, without that force, there's going to be no movement and no goal achievement. So it's how you build up the narratives. Next slide, please. Now, we won't talk about this, but I'm sure you'll be able to download these slides and go through them all. And so this is the first table on the left with the mainstream neoliberal framing, and then the framing that Randy and I came up with for the same sort of thing. So, for example, just look at the first row. Nation is living beyond its means. That's it's going to run out of something. And that's used to talk about government spending, which we all know in this group here, the government can't run out of its own currency. And so that's the implied meaning whenever they say that is, oh, excess spending, we have to sacrifice, we have to pull in our belts, give up, cuts are needed immediately. Whereas when I say government spending puts money in our pockets, that's a metaphorical claim. It's, you know, our pockets are getting things in it. Government invests in productive capacity of our nation, and both of those things are invoking an implied meaning. They're metaphorical, but the meaning that we get out of those metaphors are that our income's rising, good, more of it please, and that the capacity of the government to provide for our needs is rising. Okay, by way of conclusion then, always think about the way you frame the alternative you wish to promote. Always think about the truth sandwich. It's not about producing better fact correspondence or more logical propositions. The aim is to achieve that task by producing a smart set of metaphors. And the thing I'd say about Twitter, by the last statement I'd make, is that the research on Twitter demonstrates very clearly that it's a very poor means of communication to debate anything. It's an absolute waste of time to debate anything on Twitter. What Twitter's great for is leading a person to a more complex resource, like a report or a blog post or a paper or something like that. And moreover, and this is the thing, and this is really significant, the way in which you write your tweet, you've only got a few characters, but the way you write the tweet conditions the way the person will read the resource you're pointing them to. So if you want them to read a paper that's talking about the role of government, etc., to improve our public education system, then you can frame that with language in your tweet that they'll be positively disposed when they read that report from the page one. And the way you frame your tweet can have the opposite effect, to turn them off the report, even though your intention is to turn them onto the report. So those things are complex, and I urge people, progressives, to do more research, to do more understanding in the field of communication and those things, to become much more effective agents in this huge battle that we've got on our hands to improve our society. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you. And normally people clap, but we're not having any clapping today. Thank you.
But we're waving our hands in the air.
I'm clapping. Thank you so much.
Bill, thank you so much. And now we want people to ask questions. And if you want to put your name in the chat, I will call on you, and Rosie will unmute you, or you can unmute yourselves. Well, I'm going to ask you something if nobody else comes up with I think what bothers me the most, Bill, is one of the first things you said was about that macroeconomics is a discipline that can't be communicated in a couple of tweets. It's a serious, complicated discipline. And yet the neoliberal narrative is, as Steve always says, it's baked into the culture. It is everywhere. They're communicating, they're teaching us how to think, in sitcoms and advertisements and serious journalism and jokes. So countering that is overwhelming.
I mean, that's the point, that it's incredibly difficult to do that. And Louisa Connors has she studies literature and cognition within literature, and she'll come home and say to me, look at this crap. And but it's just a novel about a family or something. And within it is all this mainstream macroeconomics, but completely wrong. And but it reinforces all the narratives. And so they don't have to educate. They're a propaganda machine. And one of the things that I mentioned in Adelaide is that the week before last, was that we have to create propaganda machines. And we shouldn't feel ashamed about that. I know progressives sort of somehow reel from the idea, you know, that oh, we're going to have marketing and propaganda, but that's absolutely essential. And building up the story bit by bit is really a complex thing. And you know, I've been at this for years now, and it's a really daunting task. We're up against incredibly powerful financial interests, backed by military interests, who are experts at framing and using language and using all the different communication modes available. And, you know, this began with the Power Manifesto in the early 70s and this current era. And I urge people to read that and to learn the multi-dimension way in which they attacked our sensibilities to produce this fictional world that benefits them and discriminates against our best interests.
Oh, that's so true. I remember one of the first things I read first articles I read of George Lakoff, and he said that progressives study law and economics and political science and history, and conservatives study advertising and marketing. And yeah. That's exactly what you're saying. They know how to market this stuff.
It's not, you're not wrong. I mean, one of the things that, and I mean, this has been a topic recently where myself and say Thomas Fartzi, my co-author, has taken a lot of flack from progressives that for daring to say that a lot of the progressive research effort and writing effort went by the wayside into what we call identity issues. Now, I've been around longer than Thomas, and what I saw in the early 70s with the rise of postmodernism in the humanities and the way that moved into the social sciences was that the left abandoned class, economic class, as a organising framework for analysis, in which you would then embed the very legitimate issues about race and gender and sexual preference and all of those other identity issues, and started to do a lot of work on identity as a class location in itself, quite separate from economic class. And they also got waylaid into elaborate discussions within the philosophy of science about hermeneutics and ontology and methodology. But and all of those things are valuable and interesting, and I've been very interested in all of that literature myself. But the upshot was that the heterodox side of economics essentially abandoned the macroeconomic space and got lost in or pursued all of these other issues and left the mainstream to the macroeconomic space to themselves. And and so really what MMT has done, I think, and my purpose when I started out with Warren on this and then Randy, was that we had to reclaim that macroeconomic space, that while studies of gender and studies of race and all of those other things are incredibly important parts of our developing our cultural sense and our civilization and our sophistication, somebody had to take the macroeconomic space back. And that was really what our agenda was about. And so for years, we've been now the only voice on the progressive side fighting it out in the macroeconomic space. And we need many more troops. But you're right, the conservative side of politics stayed in that space, manipulated it, and poured heaps of money into marketing and psychology and language, cognitive experts and all the rest of it to really command that space. And, we're fighting with hardly any resources. And, when you think about it, it was only a few of us who started all of this. And so we've got a long way to go. And I remember back in the 90s when we started out, Warren and Randy were quite optimistic. And I put that down just to being American, that the Americans always seem optimistic to me. Whereas Australians are somewhat more circumspect, I think. And I said to them at the time, I said, this is probably going to take beyond our lifetimes because we're challenging a massive machine and we've got hardly any resources and we've just got to work and work and work and be relentless. And so that's what we're up against. It's not going to happen. And I saw yesterday on Twitter, there was an article in the mainstream Australian press about me. And it was sort of a reasonable article. It was a reasonable attempt to talk about MMT. It still got things wrong, but it was actually a reasonable try. And I saw all these tweets coming out from MMT activists saying, "Oh, we've won, we're winning," and I just don't like that sort of language. I think it's not a competition here; it's a war, and we haven't won. We haven't gone close to winning until our textbook is the mainstream textbook in all universities, and all the graduates who go into policy and central banks are MMTers. That's when we can feel that we've changed the system.
That's for sure. If identity is decoupled from class, it gives them a free ride. They don't have to. It keeps us arguing amongst ourselves.
Yes, divide and conquer.
Absolutely.
The workers start fighting among themselves. So you then get MMTers on Twitter recently, accusing other MMTers of being transphobic.
Yeah, exactly.
And quite distasteful accusations. And when I can tell you the person being accused is nowhere near transphobic, wouldn't have even thought of that.
And who benefits from that division?
Yeah, it's that divide, but see, race and those things have always been used by conservatives to divide and conquer labour movements and progressive thought. Because if we can fight among ourselves, then we're not fighting them, and that's the nature of things.
It always comes back to class. Doesn't anybody have questions? I could talk with Bill all night, but you don't want to hear me talking to him.
And to put a finer point on it, I've got work to do this afternoon, so.
Oh, well, that's just horrifying. Okay.
I can talk for about 10 more minutes.
Okay. Well, does anybody
Hey, Virginia?
Yes.
Virginia, this is Steve, real quick. Bill, I want to thank you for doing this because, I mean, even though I've heard this before, it's something that I need reinforced because I have a trigger in the back of my head that when it flips, it's game on, and it's hard for me to shut it down because, I feel the pain of austerity, and I personally feel, I live it, right? It's not like some fictitious thing out there. And this whole line of thinking this whole line of thinking that you guys have been able to start tying together to help us better frame our arguments. It's like a battle of wills between the guy who was fearful of losing his home and the guy who's trying to educate at the same time. And I think that that's a very real struggle there. When you're a couple steps removed from fear of losing everything, it's a little less challenging to be. I don't know if I'm making my point here, but
yeah, and I'm glad you made it, Steve. I wasn't going to bring it up myself, but I'm glad you made it.
Yep.
Who said you've got to don't get angry, get even? It was one of those film actors, Arnie Schwarzenegger or something like that. And because as soon as you get angry, you've lost. And as soon as you lose your stability, you've lost. And personally, I see things come up on Twitter, especially personal attacks on me or others, and I just sort of say, I'm going to get on there and I'm just going to tell them all to fuck off. But I don't. And I've got a rule that I never send something unless I've thought about it. And if I'm really angry, I have to sleep on it before. And it's amazing when you write something when you're angry and then sleep on it. Next morning you'll say, how could have I ever said that? And you'll say it in a different, more effective way using language and framing. So I urge you all, but Steve, because you're the head of the organisation, you do get angry. And I know why you get angry, and I feel the anger, and I at times in my life I've had that anger too. But that's what they want us to do, just get angry and spit out anger and bile, and meanwhile they're calm and collected, ruining our lives. So it's really important that with the communication tools at our disposal, that you learn how to use them properly, and anger will never lead you to proper use. So I really urge your progressives to adopt a smart, sophisticated, collected, calm, lethal strategy to get even, not angry.
Bill, we have a question from Barbara. Barbara, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm a progressive Democrat in Arizona, and looking at the campaigns. And I was looking at a graph today that was really interesting. It showed the proposed spending that of the different candidates among Democrats, and I wonder who put this up there. And it showed Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as having budgets proposed that are far, far, far exceeding anyone else's. But if I'm thinking right about MMT, that's good, because they are proposing a great deal of very important spending on the people in this country, but that will be used against them in terms of having a, quote, outrageous budget. How would we counter that or deal with that?
Well, it mightn't be good depending on what they're spending it on, but and that's where the narrative, that's where your counter has to be when presenting these types of figures. You play down the figures and you talk about what's actually what the destination is.
Yes.
What the purpose is. So if they're talking in your context about M for A, and you've got to be able to come up with simple ways of explaining what a destination like M for A will deliver to people in terms of not financial terms, but in terms of quality of life and well-being, and the things we'll always buy into if it's presented to us in that way. And so the right are going to, and I include Joe Biden among them, he's going to be talking about the threat of higher taxes or inflation or all of the other things, whereas a good progressive Democrat's going to be talking about, people having secure healthcare opportunities, and they're not going to lose their teeth because they can't afford to keep them any longer, and the destinations. You've got to have the destination linked to the actual event, and you've got to have the causation linked from the event to the destination so that it forces that destination has to be forced. And the narrative always has to have those components in it.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, it's basically what the high budgets are for healthcare for all, for addressing climate change, for increasing jobs, for a better education for everyone, and so we should be talking about those things.
Would be at the forefront. What does that mean? What do those destinations mean? How is that going to transform family life in American cities and regions? And who's going to benefit? You know, talk about the beneficiaries. And my feeling is that you're going to have massive number of beneficiaries relative to currently, and that's an easy, to me, that's a pretty easy argument.
Yeah.
Bill, do you have time for one more question from Claudine?
Yeah, Claudine, I can do.
Who actually lives in Australia.
Actually, whereabouts do you live, Claudine?
Hi, Dr. Mitchell. I just saw you speak at the Sustainable Prosperity Conference.
Yes.
Which was just world class. And I thank you so much for doing that and all the speakers for taking part. That was just amazing. I actually had a question that related to something that you said there, if it's okay. I was very concerned to hear you say that, you know, you've been at this for decades now, of course, and that MMT is catching on kind of slowly, and that if I understood you correctly, you were saying that you have grave concerns about us actually getting there as far as government spending on necessary programs go in time with what the scientific community has told us we need to do. Did I understand you correctly when you were saying that you're concerned that we won't make it in time to avoid pretty certain environmental collapse type of thing?
You got that right. I mean, what I said specifically was that A, I don't know, but B, I'm smart and I read research literature, so I think that it's correct.
Right.
If the climate scientists are correct, and remember that all predictions carry a standard error, so there's a confidence band around them. But if the most extreme, so right out on the edge of the confidence limit, if the most extreme climate science predictions are correct, well, then I don't think we can respond to those in a smooth, peaceful way by transforming the social system and the way in which we understand governments. I don't think that's a slow burn, because what we need is we're undergoing a massive education effort here in MMT.
Yeah.
And it's taking years and years, and it's and for all the reasons we talked earlier, it's up against massive resistance. And think about what I said earlier in the talk about construal. Construal doesn't necessarily happen overnight. You have to be really reprogrammed with whole stacks of, you know, constant barrage of new frames and languages. And so education takes time. And if the extreme climate science is correct, we don't really have much time, as I understand it. So
right.
That leads me to, and then does, you know, someone said to me the other day, oh, well, so if you're catastrophizing like that, why don't we just live it up? And well, that's not the optimist in me. I think we should do everything we can as quickly as possible, but
right.
I suspect there's going to be some aggro involved in dealing with the climate crisis, similar to what might happen if we run out of oil. There'll be a military conflagration if we ever ran out of oil, and so, you know, I mean, it's the constant tension in me as an optimist, as a person who looks forward, to a person who believes we can meet challenges always, but against the sort of the stark realities that I keep reading about.
Right. Thank you. Well, I would just add quickly that I sure do hope that Bernie gets in and declares the climate emergency a national emergency right away, like he said he would.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is that, say, during the Second World War, our main industry sector, the manufacturing sector, basically lost all its workforce, the men, and were replaced by another workforce that had no experience or training, the women, and productivity rose. And those sort of historical lessons tell me that humanity can rise to challenges if the threat is understood to be extreme.
Right.
So with the Japanese sort of Australians worrying about the Japanese taking over the country, which was a real threat. There were submarines caught in Sydney Harbour and bombs dropped on our mainland. The very threat of that forced us to dramatic action of the sort that would not normally happen in a typical societal transition. So that's why I'm an optimist. I think ultimately we might rise to the challenge, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, is that all right?
Bill, you have gone above and beyond. Thank you so much. Steve, do you want to say good night and then speak to the company?
Absolutely. And Bill, yes, of course, thank you very much. And I appreciate you being so patient and caring and giving here. I mean that from the bottom of my heart.
Okay, thank you.
You go ahead and we'll let you go on with your night if you'd like. If not, I just want to go ahead and close us out and kind of let everybody know.
Learn some geography, Steve. Learn some geography. It's not night; it's the middle of the day for me.
Oh well, yeah, that's true. It's quite night here, but the kids are asleep.
Yeah, I'm working.
I'll let you get back to your work day. How's that?
Yeah, thank you, and all the best to everybody. Take care.
Thank
To you as well.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell.
Tell Louise I said hello.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so obviously it was really, really wonderful to have Bill join us. We've had Pavlina join us. We've had Warren Mosler join us. We've had Fadil Kaboub join us. And, we've been trying our best, working very, very, very hard. Many of you all maybe don't realize it, but we meet almost nightly, trying to pull these things off. And we desperately need help. We need help. We have a very, very small team of people that are actually leaning in and doing the legwork here. And in order for us to really, really be able to, you heard, he basically said, we need all the help we can get. And not just MMT, but real progressives does, and real progress in action. In order for us to really be in a position, all these other groups that are organizing, they don't have an MMT lens, folks. They do not have an MMT lens. And if we are able to get folks to really, really take the time to lean in and help out with this, we can begin outreach to those groups and start really being a broker and a bridge to helping organize so that we don't have to wait until our children are older and maybe in our lifetime be able to survive and maybe meet this climate change head on before, like Professor Keene said, we have to have the military take over. Folks, this is serious. And I'd like to believe that our role here is very important and that we have an opportunity to do something truly special. And now that we have a legitimate 501c3, which means that we can take donations and do things and work with academics and actually build from that end. And we also have a 501c4 that allows us to get engaged in the political debate. If we have people that will invest themselves and their money, quite frankly, and get other people involved and not be passive about it, but become really, really interested in seeing us be successful. I think we can really, really make some serious change, make a big difference. But it truly can't just be 8 people scuttling around trying to make it happen. That is not a revolution. That right there is a blip on the radar. And it's going to take all of us. And I hope that you all will raise your hand, say, how can I help? And we will find a way to get you involved, because there's no task too small, and there's no amount of care that we can't find a way to use. So we need everybody. And, I know that this has been a very difficult process. Think about it. We did not take on a simple subject. We did not take on one of these easy, hey, just join us and we'll just go along with the flow, and we'll go with the Dem-Enter crowd over here. We'll just flow. We took on one of the most difficult subjects of them all. And that means that we're going to have people that get upset. There's going to be all kinds of people that are incredulous at the things we're saying. They're going to not believe us. And so naturally, it's going to cause friction in the movement. And it's very important to realize that that's kind of, regardless of whether you said it as sweet as pie or it got nasty, in the end, people don't understand this stuff. And it requires an organization that's willing to do this stuff and not just sort of run off to do their own solo thing, because our enemy is absolutely well funded. Our enemy believes in their cause apparently more than many of us do even. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to keep us in neoliberal hell. So my hope is that as an organization, we will provide the tools, the processes, and a landing spot to do meaningful activism and meaningful education. And hopefully, if we really, really put our butts into it, maybe even provide some people some careers. The opportunity is there. These are legitimate organizations. They're legitimate nonprofit corporations, and they require legitimate people stepping into legitimate roles to take on legitimate activities that we can count on. And I think you guys are the greatest people on the planet for even caring about this stuff. So I hope that you all can help us either bring people in or raise your hand and ask how you can pitch in and help. So with that, I pretty much want to just thank you all for hanging in there for 2 hours and listening to Bill and myself yap on. And if you need anything at all, please let us know, and we'll be happy to accommodate you in any way we can. But for tonight, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you all so much and have a good night. Does anybody have any questions before we go?
I'd like to thank you. It's Claudine speaking. I'd just like to thank you so much. I haven't been more involved because my life has been so busy, and I've also had some personal catastrophes, but I certainly look forward to getting more involved in the future, and I just thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Claudine. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We look forward to working with you, Claudine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, we do.
Well, Steve, thanks so much. Have a good night, and we'll talk tomorrow, I'm sure.
You got it. All right, folks. Thank you all very much. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.